Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Louis Pennyfield, and I will be explaining to you Chapter 13 of the amazing novel Jane Eyre. I'll be using the Barnes & Noble's version of the book because that bookstore is an amazing one, and it was on sale on Amazon. Okay, now, first, let's recap the story. So, Jane was now working for Adele as her tutor, who was under Mr. Rochester. It's been 3 months, and it's now January, and she takes a letter from Mrs. Fairfax to a nearby town. She encounters a horse and rider, and they just pass her by. However, they slip on the ice, and making the rider injured. So she helps the man back to his horse, and they go separate ways, while Jane was feeling happy because she helped someone. Coincidentally, since the novel is somewhat cliche, she meets the man back at the house, and he turned out to be Mr. Rochester himself. Now in Chapter 13, Mr. Rochester was staying at the house, so Jane and Adele had to move to upstairs for Adele's lessons. Mrs. Fairfax told Jane that she would be having tea with Mr. Rochester, and told her to wear something nice. So Jane got her second best dress and a pearl ornament she received from Miss Temple, and wore them that evening. Mr. Rochester was indifferent when he met Jane, and he will be evaluating her. He praised her teaching skills, asked about her background, and he asked about her talents. She played the piano and showed him her sketches. 3 hours has passed since the beginning of tea time, so Mr. Rochester told them to go out. Jane asked about his background from Mrs. Fairfax, and she replied that his background led to him acting like that since he was not forgiving of his family, and they made him do what he didn't want to do to gain wealth. Okay, so in this chapter, some themes include patriarchalism, gender relation, somewhat radical feminist ideas, and its Gothic theme. The patriarchalism is embodied by Mr. Rochester when he said in page 140, "Excuse my tone of command. I used to say, do this, and it is done." The second theme, gender relation, is shown when Jane Eyre and Mrs. Fairfax followed Mr. Rochester's orders obediently. This is not surprising, since during that time it was the Victorian era where the women are still submissive to men. There was a small portrayal of radical feminism because of Jane's sketches, which showed her interest in art. Since this was somewhat feminist because women were not given these kinds of opportunities in this time period. Now onto the cathedrals. I'm just kidding. The Gothic theme is shown in the sketches, which are very dark. Here's a detail of one of them. Sinking below, the bird and mast. A drowned corpse glanced through the green water. A fair arm was the only limb clearly visible, once the bracelet had been washed or torn. In page 142, another Gothic aspect in this chapter was the mystery because Jane tried to find more about Mr. Rochester's background, and she received an evasive answer from Mrs. Fairfax. Throughout the novel, Jane's feeling of loneliness was shown. In this chapter especially, when asked about her aunts and uncles, she replied with none that I never saw, and replied the same to questions about her home and her siblings, which she actually had none. This was also shown again in the beginning of the chapter, where she liked the noise created by the people working for Mr. Rochester since the master was actually present, because it made the house more lively, I guess. Now, for predictions. Since this is a cliche novel, I would think that Mr. Rochester and Jane would fall in love with one another. And this is my presentation. So, any questions?